What really holds a legendary friendship together when the cameras stop rolling? When the applause fades, the studio lights dim, and the crowds go home, what remains between two men who built part of their legacy side by side? And how much of what we think we know about Hollywood icons is simply the version they allowed us to see? For millions of moviegoers in the 1970s and 80s, Burt Reynolds and Jerry Reed were more than co-stars. They represented a kind of effortless cool that felt distinctly American. Two Southern men trading jokes, loyalty, and horsepower across sunburned highways. They made rebellion look charming. They made friendship look easy. On screen, their chemistry seemed almost accidental, as though the cameras had simply happened to capture two old friends being themselves. But off-screen, their bond was shaped by ambition, insecurity, loyalty, and the quiet understanding of men who had both fought their way out of difficult beginnings. Before Burt Reynolds passed away in 2018, he began speaking more candidly about Jerry Reed. Not just about his talent, which was undeniable, but about his character, the resilience behind the humor, the complexity behind the grin. In doing so, Reynolds reframed their partnership in ways few fans expected. And perhaps in reflecting on Reed, Reynolds was also trying to make sense of his own story. The partnership that looked too easy. When Smokey and the Bandit hit theaters in 1977, audiences didn't just watch a movie, they experienced a cultural moment. CB radios crackled with slang. Trans Ams roared down highways. Truck drivers became folk heroes. And at the center of it all were two men who seemed to understand each other without trying. Reynolds played Bandit Darville with playful confidence. He winked at the camera, at the law, at the audience itself. Jerry Reed's Cletus Snowman, Snow was different, steady, practical, slyly observant. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. He grounded the chaos. But here's the question. Was their bond built purely on shared Southern roots and mutual humor? Or was it something deeper, an unspoken recognition of struggle in one another? Their collaboration didn't begin with Smokey. Reed had already worked with Reynolds in WW and the Dixie Dance Kings and later in Gator. At that time, Hollywood saw Reed primarily as a musician. A gifted one, certainly, a Grammy-winning songwriter behind hits like Amos Moses and When You're Hot, You're Hot. But a serious actor? The industry wasn't convinced. Reynolds was. By the mid-1970s, Reynolds was at the height of his power. After Deliverance and The Longest Yard, he wasn't just a star, he was a box office force. Studios trusted him. Audiences adored him. Directors wanted him. And with that influence came leverage. When casting for Smokey and the Bandit began, studio executives suggested safer, more conventional actors for the role of Snowman. Names with longer film resumes. Names that felt bankable. Reynolds insisted on Jerry Reed.
Why?
Because Reed understood something that couldn't be manufactured. He didn't have to imitate Southern rhythm or trucker culture. He had grown up around it. His timing wasn't rehearsed, it was lived. His pauses, his glances, his offhand remarks, they carried authenticity. And then Reed did something that transformed the film entirely. He wrote and performed Eastbound and Down. Those opening chords didn't just accompany the movie, they defined it. The song became a rallying cry, a musical shorthand for freedom, speed, and rebellion. Even today, those notes transport listeners back to open highways and CB radio handles. Think about it, how many actors get remembered for a role? And how many help shape the entire identity of a film? Reed did both. Brotherhood in an industry of alliances. Their partnership continued in Hooper, Smokey and the Bandit 2, and the Cannonball Run. On screen, they teased each other relentlessly. Off-screen, they shared long conversations, quiet loyalty, and an understanding forged in similar upbringings. When Reynolds chose not to appear in Smokey and the Bandit Part 3, the studio turned to Reed to carry the torch. He stepped into the Bandit role himself, a symbolic moment that spoke volumes. A few years earlier, it would have seemed unthinkable. Now, it felt natural. But Hollywood friendships are often built on convenience. Films wrap. Careers shift. Alliances dissolve. Why did theirs endure? Reynolds would later hint at the answer. Beneath Reed's humor, he saw a man who carried invisible weight. And perhaps Reed saw the same in him. The cost of toughness. Burt Reynolds built his public persona on effortlessness. He leaned back in chairs as if gravity itself admired him. He laughed easily. He appeared unbreakable. But toughness comes at a price. Reynolds performed many of his own stunts. He believed it gave performances authenticity. It also left him with chronic knee damage and back injuries. Years of physical strain accumulated quietly. Then came the accident on the set of City Heat. A jaw injury led to significant weight loss and intense pain. Doctors prescribed medication. What began as recovery slowly edged toward dependence. How many careers have quietly shifted under the weight of something prescribed to heal? As the 1980s progressed, the box office landscape changed. New stars emerged. Audiences evolved. Films that once guaranteed success now struggled. Reynolds felt the shift personally. The industry that once centered on him seemed to move forward without him. Public adoration is powerful, but it can be fleeting. Have you ever noticed how quickly applause turns into silence? Financial trouble compounded the emotional toll. Extravagant spending, business ventures that didn't pan out, and a painful divorce from Lonnie Anderson pushed Reynolds into bankruptcy in the 1990s. He auctioned off memorabilia, not for nostalgia, but survival. Privately, he battled depression. Despite fame, despite recognition, he felt increasingly isolated. Interviews in later years revealed a man reflecting deeply on regret. He famously turned down roles in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Terms of Endearment, decisions he believed altered the trajectory of his career. His Oscar-nominated performance in Boogie Nights reignited critical respect. Yet even that resurgence felt bittersweet. He reportedly clashed with director Paul Thomas Anderson, uncertain about how he was being portrayed. Behind the charm was vulnerability. And through it all, he kept working. Even after heart surgery in 2010. Even as pain persisted. When he spoke about Jerry Reed later in life, his admiration carried gravity. It wasn't just about talent. It was about endurance. Jerry Reed's quiet endurance. Jerry Reed's path to success was anything but smooth. Born in Atlanta and raised in rural Georgia, Reed grew up in poverty. His parents separated when he was young. At times, he lived in foster care. Stability was rare. Music became refuge. He learned guitar as a child, absorbing rhythm with uncanny instinct. By his teenage years, he was playing in bars, too young to drink, but skilled enough to command attention. Those early performances hardened him. They taught him how to read a room, how to turn silence into applause. But early recording contracts brought little security. Money came and went. Recognition flickered. Then Elvis Presley recorded Guitar Man. That moment changed everything. Presley's endorsement validated Reed as a songwriter and opened doors across Nashville. His career accelerated. Hits followed. Awards accumulated. But hardship leaves imprints. Reed was a lifelong smoker. The habit, common in his generation, would later cost him dearly. Emphysema and respiratory illness gradually reduced his stamina. Performances shortened. Touring became difficult. And yet, he rarely complained. Friends described him as loyal, generous, quick with a joke but serious when it mattered. He supported young musicians quietly. He avoided public drama. He valued privacy. Reynolds saw that. In later interviews, Reynolds suggested that Reed sometimes felt underestimated in Hollywood. Despite his charisma, despite his songwriting brilliance, he was often categorized narrowly, as a musician dabbling in film. Did that perception sting? Perhaps. But Reed didn't chase validation loudly. He continued creating. He continued showing up. As the years passed, both men faced aging in an industry obsessed with youth. Roles shifted. Health faltered. Fame fluctuated. Yet their mutual respect remained constant. Final reflections. Jerry Reed passed away in 2008 from complications related to emphysema. He was 71. Reynolds was deeply affected. Though he didn't always express grief publicly, those close to him noted the loss weighed heavily. 10 years later, when Reynolds himself passed away at 82, many tributes mentioned their partnership. Clips of Smokey and the Bandit resurfaced. Eastbound and Down echoed again across radio waves and social media feeds. But beyond nostalgia, their story invites deeper reflection. What does it mean to stand by someone in an industry built on image? How do two men maintain loyalty while navigating ego, fame, financial strain, and physical decline? And why did audiences respond so powerfully to their connection? Perhaps because it felt real. Their friendship wasn't perfect. It wasn't immune to distance or disagreement. But it was grounded in shared beginnings, mutual respect, and an understanding that both had fought hard for what they achieved. In the end, what remains isn't just box office numbers or award nominations. It's the image of two men laughing in a Trans Am, trading lines that felt improvised, racing toward a horizon that symbolized freedom. But maybe the deeper legacy lies off-screen, in quiet loyalty, in gratitude expressed late but sincerely, in recognition that behind every larger-than-life persona is a human being carrying invisible weight. So when we watch those films now, are we simply enjoying nostalgia? Or are we witnessing something rarer, a genuine bond captured on celluloid? And if the cameras had kept rolling after the final cut, what conversations might we have heard? Perhaps jokes. Perhaps silence. Perhaps two men acknowledging, in their own understated way, that they were lucky to have found a brother in an industry that rarely offers permanence. In a world where fame shifts quickly and alliances fade, their story asks us to consider something enduring. What truly defines a partnership? Is it success? Shared headlines? Or is it the quiet decision, made repeatedly over years, to show up for one another? When the engines quieted and the lights dimmed, Burt Reynolds and Jerry Reed were no longer Bandit and Snowman. They were simply two men who understood each other. And sometimes, that's the most legendary story of all. The world remembers them in roaring scenes, black Trans Ams slicing through Georgia pines, tire smoke curling like punctuation marks, and a soundtrack that felt like the good humor of a road trip bottled and sold as cinema. But memory, for those who witnessed the quieter moments, holds other images. The tired hands of actors after a long day of takes, the off-camera laughter over a forgotten line, the small, almost invisible refills of trust that accumulate between people who choose to rely on one another. What do those private, ordinary moments teach us about a life in the bright and hungry business of show? Still, he kept working. Unlike Reynolds, Reed never chased the Hollywood hierarchy. He accepted the roles offered, often comic Southern characters, and rarely complained about typecasting. While the industry boxed him into a familiar persona, his musicianship remained deeply respected. In small studios and at late-night gigs, people who knew music differently watched him and called him something else, a craftsman. Could an artist measure success by charts and awards alone, or is there something purer in being asked back to tell another story? He joined the country supergroup The Old Dogs in the 1990s, reconnecting with audiences through storytelling rooted in experience rather than trend. On stage, Reed's voice, rough-edged, melodic, intimate, carried the sound of someone who had spent a life learning rhythms from highways and honky-tonks. Those who saw him up close remember how he'd tilt his head at the end of a phrase, as if testing if the audience had caught the exact shade of meaning he'd put there. What does it mean, after all, to create songs that age with you rather than chase the young and restless? As his health declined, Reed didn't stage a dramatic farewell. He simply adjusted, writing, recording, and appearing as long as his body allowed. There was a kind of dignity to that steady cadence, the artist who eases himself off the highway instead of crashing in a blaze of publicity. He passed away on September 1, 2008, from complications related to emphysema. The date is a line in a biography, but to those who knew him, it marked a silence that echoed with small private memories. A hand on a shoulder, a shared cigarette behind a motorhome, the way he'd hum under his breath while waiting for a scene to reset. And that's when Reynolds' reflections deepened. In interviews after Reed's death, Reynolds spoke with unusual emotion. He credited Reed not only with elevating Smokey and the Bandit, but with grounding it. He made one point repeatedly: Jerry Reed's timing wasn't learned. It was instinct. How often do we watch someone perform and mistake practice for something deeper, a pulse or a bone-deep sense of where a joke will land? Reynolds recalled how Reed initially hesitated to join Smokey and the Bandit due to scheduling conflicts. Reynolds' response was classic. "I'll just drive to your house and take you to the set myself." It wasn't bravado. It was certainty. That certainty was the kind that asks a favor not as a transaction but as an assertion. This person matters enough that I will rearrange my world for them. What would your life look like if you made that simple, stubborn choice for the handful of people you trust? Reynolds later called Reed a brother, an uncommon term in an industry built on temporary alliances. He admitted that Reed's death felt like losing one of the few people he fully trusted in Hollywood. And in a subtle shift, Reynolds acknowledged something else. Reed had shared his success, not merely benefited from it. How many stars can say that about a co-star? How many people can point to another and say, "They made me better, and they kept me steady"? Jerry Reed's side of the story reads like the opposite of a tabloid headline. He never framed himself as Reynolds' equal in fame. Instead, he consistently credited Reynolds for opening doors when studios hesitated. He admitted openly that his role in Smokey and the Bandit happened because Reynolds insisted. Without that push, Reed believed the part might have gone elsewhere. How often do we underestimate the quiet labor behind a casting choice? The phone calls, the simple insistence, the acts of faith. When Reed stepped into the Bandit role for the third film, he joked about it. "I get to wear the hat and drive the car." But underneath the humor was understanding. The opportunity existed because of their bond. He never presented it as replacing Reynolds. He saw it as honoring something his friend had built. There's a humility in that kind of stewardship. Why do so few in the public eye show it? Looking back, it's tempting to reduce their story to nostalgia. Fast cars, clever lines, and a soundtrack that still sparks memories. But beneath that surface was something more resonant for those who've lived long enough to see fame fade and friendships tested. Two men from modest beginnings reached extraordinary heights. Both faced physical decline. Both confronted regret. Both discovered that public image rarely reflects private cost. Is that revelation the reason older fans feel the films differently now, as if each laugh carries a shadow they didn't notice the first time? So here's the deeper question. When the spotlight dims, what truly remains? Awards, box office numbers, or the people who stood beside you? In his later years, Burt Reynolds seemed to answer that clearly. Not with bravado, but with reflection. Jerry Reed wasn't just a co-star. He was a stabilizing force during Reynolds' most successful years. A creative partner who shaped the rhythm of films that defined a generation. A friend who required no performance. Reynolds found, in private conversations and on late-night stages, that Reed's presence altered the architecture of his life. Where others traded in glamour, Reed traded in timing, improvisation, and an uncanny feel for how to land a scene without stealing it. Did that feel like a bargain to Reynolds, swapping the glare of stardom for the quiet truth of collaboration? He would say yes. And Reed, in turn, understood that Reynolds' insistence had altered his path forever. The man who drove to his house to fetch him had also driven the trajectory of his career in ways Reed appreciated but rarely flaunted. That mutual curating of each other's stories. Who gets to be in, who gets to be honored, who gets to tell the joke, is a small, human economy that rarely shows up in trade papers. Who protects the stories behind the stories? For viewers now in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, the story carries added weight. It's no longer just about a blockbuster comedy. It's about loyalty in an industry built on impermanence. About resilience in bodies that eventually falter. About regret, and about gratitude spoken before it's too late. When you watch those old scenes now, can you sense the care between the leads, the unspoken handshake that keeps a moment honest? In the end, perhaps the most surprising revelation wasn't scandal or hidden conflict. It was something quieter. Burt Reynolds admitted that for all his fame, very few people in Hollywood felt like family. Jerry Reed did. And that may be the most enduring part of their legacy. Not the car chases, not the box office numbers, but the rare and hard-earned trust between two men who understood each other long before the audience ever did. So what do we keep when we leave the stage? For Reynolds and Reed, it seems the answer was simple and stubborn: one another. Isn't that the kind of friendship we all hope for? Steady, kind, forgiving, stubborn, loyal, patient, honest, brave, warm, present when it matters?